Hello, I need your advice. Imagine living with your partner for over 15 years, raising children together, building a shared future, only to find out it was all a lie. One day, as you wait for their call, they simply don't answer. And then, when the truth comes out, it's not just about betrayal. They've been living with this secret for more than half their life. How would you react? I decided to run away from everything, but was that the right choice? This isn't just a story about infidelity. It's a story of loss, pain, and choices, and I still don't know how it will end. Sarah and I had been together for nearly 16 years. Our marriage wasn't perfect, but are there any perfect marriages? Every morning, I woke up to the sound of her footsteps in the kitchen, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. Our days were predictable, but that routine gave me a sense of stability. I thought it was enough for happiness. Then one day everything changed. Started small. Sarah began spending more time on her phone. She'd often get distracted by messages, and when I asked who she was texting, her answers were distant, a friend or work. Her eyes stopped meeting mine the way they used to. Sometimes, she'd laugh at something on her screen, but the laughter would quickly fade when she noticed me watching. One evening, I noticed something strange. Sarah came home later than usual. I was making dinner, the kids were already at the table, and she walked in looking a bit disheveled and irritated. Her hair was hastily tied up, her makeup smudged. "Sorry, I got held up," she said quickly, avoiding my gaze, and headed upstairs. That night I couldn't sleep. Her aloofness, her lack of desire to talk, even how she avoided my touch in bed, it all unsettled me. The next day, I noticed another crack. A receipt from a fancy downtown restaurant fell out of her bag. It was a place we'd never been to. The date on the receipt was one of those nights she'd claimed to be working late. I tried to talk to her. "Sarah, you seem different lately. Is something wrong?" She shrugged and replied, "You're imagining things. It's just work stress." Her voice was calm, but her eyes darted around, avoiding mine. I wanted to believe her. I always believed her. A few weeks later, during dinner, Sarah received a text. Her phone buzzed, and she grabbed it so quickly it was as if she was afraid I might see. She glanced at the message, smiled faintly, and then set the phone down face down. I tried to stay calm, but inside, I was boiling. Eventually, I decided to check her phone. When she fell asleep, I quietly took it from her bag, but it was locked. I didn't have the password, nor did I want to cross that line. I put it back, feeling ashamed of my mistrust. Yet the doubts didn't fade. They only grew stronger. The next morning seemed like any other. Sarah kissed me on the cheek before leaving for work. "I love you," she said, but her words felt hollow. When she left, I was left with a gnawing feeling that our marriage wasn't what it once was. I didn't yet know how true that was, but the crack in our trust had already become a chasm. Days passed. The unease stayed with me, but I kept trying to reassure myself. Maybe it really is just stress, I told myself, but the reassurance didn't help. Instead, a strange certainty grew. Something hidden was poisoning our marriage. One day, as I tried to focus on work at home, our youngest daughter, Amy, approached me. She was only 10, her big brown eyes always radiating innocence that broke my heart. She came up to me holding Sarah's phone. "Daddy, what does this mean?" she asked, holding the screen out to me. I looked at the message that had popped up on Sarah's phone. It was short, but it carried the weight of all the pain I had feared. "I didn't sweat this much even at the gym. Thanks for last night." It became hard for me to breathe. I felt as though the ground had fallen away beneath my feet. A strange sensation washed over me. Part of me wanted to immediately throw the phone, smash it, destroy the evidence. But outwardly, I remained calm. "It's probably just a joke, Amy," I said gently, forcing a smile. "Go play. I'll return the phone to Mom later." Amy shrugged and ran off to her room. I was left alone with the phone. My hands trembled as I held it. For a few more seconds, I stared at the screen, hoping what I'd read was a mistake. But it wasn't. I didn't read any more messages. What I knew in that moment was already enough. Sarah had betrayed me, She had someone else, someone with whom she shared a part of her life. I placed the phone on the table, trying to gather my thoughts. I wanted to call her immediately and demand an explanation, but I didn't. I didn't know how. How could I explain that I had found out the truth because of our daughter? How could I make her tell the truth if she had been lying for so long? Instead, I just sat there. Hours passed and I didn't move. When Sarah came home, I greeted her as usual with a smile, though it was fake. She didn't notice, or she chose not to. That evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Sarah approached me with a cup of tea. She looked relaxed. "How was your day?" she asked, as if nothing had happened. "Fine," I replied, trying to mask my emotions. But in my mind, her words from years ago on our first wedding anniversary echoed. "I could never lie to you, James." That night, I couldn't sleep again. All these years, I thought we were building something real. I wasn't perfect. I knew that, but I always believed that our vows meant something. Now, everything felt different. I lay there in the dark, listening to her steady breathing beside me. She slept, oblivious to the fact that I knew. And in that darkness, I made a decision. I needed to know the whole truth before taking my next step. When you look at someone you've loved more than anything and realize that their heart has long belonged to someone else, it doesn't feel like ordinary pain. It feels like your inner world is being slowly, methodically torn apart, piece by piece. That night, lying next to Sarah as she slept as if nothing was wrong, I found myself drifting back to the past. I remembered the day we first met. It was in a small-town bar where I was working at the time. She came in with her friends, laughing so loudly and freely that it felt like the world paused to listen. Her gray-green eyes contrasted perfectly with her chestnut hair, and her smile seemed like the answer to every question I'd ever had. We got married 2 years after that meeting. It was a small wedding by a lake. She chose a simple dress, but in my eyes, she looked like a queen. We promised each other eternal love and loyalty. I remembered holding her hands in mine, feeling like I'd found my place in the world. Sarah had always been stronger than me. She had ambitions, goals she relentlessly pursued. I was just a simple man. All I wanted was for my family to be happy. I didn't need more. She often teased me about it, calling me her house cat. Back then, I thought it was a loving joke, but now every word from the past felt like a hidden clue. The early years of our marriage were happy. We traveled a lot, laughed until we cried, and went on spontaneous dates even after Amy and Lucas were born. But then, gradually, something changed. She grew colder. I noticed it but always made excuses for her. Work, kids, exhaustion. I was too soft to ask directly what was wrong. Now, as I revisited those moments, I began to search for the microscopic details I'd ignored before. The evenings she stayed late. The excuses that sounded too simple. Her absence at our family events because of urgent matters. I had blindly trusted her because I believed that love didn't need proof. A particular evening flashed through my mind. It was our 10th anniversary. I had bought flowers, hired a babysitter, and reserved a table at a restaurant. But she came home late that night, apologizing for being stuck in a meeting. I stayed at home with an untouched bottle of wine and a cold dinner, wondering if perhaps I hadn't done enough. As I recalled it, my hands began to tremble. Now everything fell into place. She wasn't staying late at work. She wasn't visiting a friend. She wasn't too tired to come home. She was simply lying, and I had swallowed those lies because I was too afraid to face the truth. Sarah stirred in her sleep. I looked at her. She seemed so peaceful, so innocent. I wanted to wake her up, to shout, to demand explanations. But I couldn't. I had never been the kind of person who gave ultimatums. I was always the one who waited, hoped, forgave. But this time it was different. My memories no longer brought comfort, only pain. Everything that had once been bright now felt like a filthy lie. Sarah hadn't just betrayed me. She had betrayed our story, our children, our home. And yet, deep down, I still loved her. That love was like a rusty knife in my chest, painful but invisible. I didn't know how to endure it, but I knew one thing. There would be no going back to the way things were. The days that followed felt like an endless, dreary labyrinth. I went to work, came home, fulfilled my duties, but inside, everything was falling apart. Sarah remained her usual self, at least outwardly. She smiled while talking to the kids, asked me her routine questions about my day, cooked dinner. Her deceit was skillfully hidden behind that routine, which made it all the more painful. My anxiety became a constant companion. Her phone had now become a symbol, one I hated and feared at the same time. I knew it might hold more answers, but I also knew those answers could be my final sentence. I started watching her more closely. She began spending more time away from home. Meetings, friends, shopping. Her words sounded plausible, but they no longer mattered to me. I didn't believe them anymore. One scene in particular stuck with me. We were sitting on the couch late at night watching some series. Sarah took out her phone and began typing, shielding the screen from me. I felt the blood rush to my head. "Who are you texting so late?" My voice was calm, but I was barely holding myself together. She didn't look up. "Jenny, her new boyfriend threw a tantrum, and she doesn't know what to do. Maybe you could give her a break? It's just a show. You could use the distraction." I tried to joke, but there was more bitterness in my tone than I intended. Sarah glanced at me, her look unusually sharp, but she quickly turned back to the screen. "James, you're acting strange tonight. Is everything okay?" I wanted to tell her no, nothing was okay, that I knew her meetings were with someone else. But once again I stayed silent. The fear of stepping into the unknown kept me trapped. My silence was like a cage, and I had locked myself in it. I knew my passivity was playing right into her hands. I was too weak to ask a direct question, too indecisive to end it. But the fear of losing her, even this lying version of her, was stronger. What would happen to the kids? What would happen to me? I couldn't imagine life without Sarah, even if this Sarah was no longer the woman I once knew. One evening during dinner, Amy asked, "Mom, why do you go to your friends so often? Don't you want to stay home with us?" Sarah laughed and said, "Oh, sweetheart, sometimes adults need a little time for themselves. But I always come back, don't I?" Her answer sounded so confident that even I almost believed her. But there was confusion in our daughter's eyes, a confusion she probably couldn't yet articulate. That night, for the first time, I seriously considered leaving. Not out of anger or resentment, but because I no longer saw a way for us to be a family. Yet at the same time, I didn't know if I could take that step. I lay in the darkness, once again listening to her steady breathing. An inner voice asked, "How long will you endure this? What will you do when you know everything?" And I had no answer. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. Sarah was still asleep, her face serene and tranquil. For the first time in a long while, I found myself gazing at her. She was still beautiful, but that beauty now felt cold and distant. By the time she woke up, I was already dressed and out the door. But I didn't go to the office as usual. Instead, I did something I'd never dared to do before. I decided to look for proof. In our small town, there was a private detective agency. I found their contact online and scheduled a consultation. When I entered their office, I was greeted by a man in his 50s, with graying hair and tired eyes. His name was Tom. "What brings you here, mister?" he asked, gesturing for me to take a seat. "James. Just James," I replied, avoiding his gaze. "So, James, how can I help you?" I hesitated. Everything I was about to say felt both painfully real and absurd, but I forced myself to speak. "My wife. I think she's cheating on me. I want to know the truth." Tom nodded as if he'd heard it hundreds of times. His voice was calm, but there was a hint of detachment. "Are you sure you want to know? The truth is often more painful than suspicion." "Yes," I said, though doubt gnawed at me from the inside. Tom asked for details. I briefly laid it all out: her behavior, the messages, the late returns home. He listened silently, occasionally nodding. "All right," he finally said. "We'll start by tracking her movements. I'll follow her for a few days and let you know what I find." I paid the deposit and left his office feeling exposed. I had taken the first step toward the truth, but was I ready for it? The following days were hell. Tom called periodically, updating me on her whereabouts. I learned that Sarah had visited the same hotel downtown twice. Once a week, she spent a few hours there before coming home as if nothing had happened. Were there any other people? I asked during one of the calls. Yes, Tom replied. The same man. They entered together and left together. Those words hit me like a punch to the gut. Now I knew for certain my wife had a lover. That evening, when Sarah came home, I could barely look at her. She talked about her day, joked with the kids, but every word she spoke echoed as a lie in my mind. I wanted to scream, to lay all the cards on the table, to force her to confess. But I didn't. Instead, I decided to wait. I wanted to know more. Who was this man? How long had it been going on? Why? That night, after Sarah fell asleep, I went to the bathroom and looked at my reflection in the mirror. The man staring back at me looked exhausted and worn. I no longer recognized myself. What are you doing? I asked myself. I had no answer. When the truth becomes clear, it feels even heavier. Each hour dragged on endlessly, and every action of Sarah's seemed like another piece of evidence against her. But now I wasn't just suspicious. I knew. Tom called a few days later. His voice was as calm as ever, but there was a certain unsettling confidence in it, as though he was used to delivering bad news. James, I found more. I think you should hear this in person. We met in his office. When I arrived, he laid a few photographs in front of me. They showed Sarah, smiling and carefree, with a man I'd never seen before. They were holding hands. In one picture, he was pulling her close, kissing her cheek. Who is he? I asked, unable to tear my eyes away from the images. His name is Richard Baker, Tom said. Married, 2 kids. He works for one of the big law firms downtown. It seems their relationship has been going on for a few years. Tom's words felt like shards of glass, each one piercing me deeper. A few years. Not months, not weeks. Years. How many years? I asked, my voice barely audible. I can't say for certain, but based on my findings, at least 5. 5 years. For 5 years, she had been living a double life. Tom looked at me sympathetically, but I could see something else in his gaze. An icy professionalism that helped him stay detached from others' pain. What do you want to do next, James? I stayed silent. My thoughts were torn between the urge to tear apart this farce immediately and the fear of what might come next. I need more time, I finally said. I have to think this through. Tom nodded. Understood. But remember, the longer you wait, the harder it will be to deal with the consequences. I returned home feeling as if the ground had been pulled out from under me. Sarah was sitting in the living room with the kids, helping Amy with her homework. Her smile was so genuine, so real. How could she lie so flawlessly? I sat down beside her, trying to appear casual. But my hands trembled, and she noticed. Are you okay? She asked, leaning closer. Her voice was filled with concern that now felt almost theatrical. Yes, just tired, I replied, avoiding her gaze. At that moment, I realized I couldn't endure this any longer. Her double life was poisoning not only me but also our family. Yet what could I do? Lay all my cards on the table? Tell the kids their mother was a liar? I wasn't ready. That night, I woke up at 3 in the morning. Sarah was asleep beside me, her face peaceful as always. I sat in the darkness, staring at her. Why did you do it? I asked silently, but the answer didn't come. In the morning, as Sarah was getting ready to leave, I dared to ask, where are you going today? To the city to meet Jenny. We're having lunch together, she replied without pausing to meet my eyes. I nodded, but inside I was boiling. She wasn't going to Jenny. I knew it. And this time I decided not to stay home waiting. That day, I felt I could no longer remain passive. Tom's words about how every moment of hesitation only made things worse echoed in my mind, pushing me to act. When Sarah left the house, I waited a few minutes before getting into my car. The drive to the city wasn't long, but it felt like an eternity. I knew where she would be. Tom had given me the address of the hotel they frequented. I parked nearby, left the car, and walked into the lobby. The quiet lobby was nearly empty, with only the reception staff busy at their computers. My palms were sweating. Everything I was about to do felt against my nature. I wasn't used to confrontation, wasn't built for battles. But this time I had no choice. Sarah was sitting in the cafe at the far end of the lobby. She wasn't alone. Across from her sat the same man, Richard, whom Tom had mentioned. They were drinking coffee, talking, laughing. Her face glowed with a happiness I hadn't seen in years. My heart pounded wildly. I didn't know what to do next. Confront them? 'Cause a scene? But what would that change? I watched them for a few more minutes. Then they stood and walked toward the elevator. My body moved almost on its own. I followed them, keeping a safe distance. They entered the elevator, and the doors closed. I was left standing in the hallway, my legs feeling weak. I returned to the lobby and sat in one of the chairs, trying to gather my thoughts. An inner voice screamed that I had to do something, but I remained paralyzed. Time passed, and I couldn't bring myself to act. When they finally emerged, I saw their smiles again. They had no idea I was there. It felt like a punch to the gut, but at the same time, I realized I now had what I came for. Undeniable proof. I waited until Sarah drove off, then headed home. She arrived a few hours later, smiling as if nothing had happened. "How was your day?" I asked, trying to sound normal. "Great," she replied. "Jenny was so happy we got to meet up." Her words were so blatantly false that it took all my strength not to laugh. That evening, I sat alone in the dark for a long time. One question kept echoing in my mind. What now? I knew I couldn't keep living like this, but was I ready to take the next step? The next morning, I woke up with the thought that I could no longer pretend nothing was happening. The days of my silence, apathy, and inaction were over. The James who had tried so hard to avoid conflicts was left behind yesterday. In the hotel corridor, Sarah disappeared again that day. She said she had errands in the city, and I nodded without asking questions. But instead of waiting for her return, I decided to act. The first thing I did was go to the kids' room. Amy and Brian were playing video games, their voices full of joy and carefreeness. That hurt the most, the thought that their little paradise was about to crumble. "Amy, Brian, I want you to pack a few things. We're going on a little trip tonight," I said, trying to sound cheerful. "Where to, Dad?" Amy asked, putting down her controller. "To Grandma's," I replied, though it was a lie. I didn't know yet where we were going, but I knew we needed to get away. The kids nodded and started packing their backpacks. Their unquestioning obedience was another reminder of how much they trusted me. I had to use that trust to protect them. By the time Sarah returned home, it was getting dark. She looked a little tired, but her smile was still on her face. "How was your day?" she asked as she walked into the living room. "Not bad," I replied. "I thought we could go visit your mom for the weekend. The kids would enjoy it, and I'll take a couple of days off work." She gave me a surprised look. "That's unexpected, but I guess it's a good idea. Did you already talk to her?" "Yes," I said, lying again. When the kids were asleep, I started packing our things. My suitcase was half empty. I didn't know how long it would take for us to figure things out, but I was sure of one thing. By morning, we wouldn't be here anymore. Sarah came into the bedroom as I was zipping up the suitcase. "Is something wrong, James?" she asked, leaning toward me. Her voice sounded innocent, almost concerned. "No, everything's fine," I replied, avoiding her gaze. That night, I didn't sleep. My mind painted the worst-case scenarios, and my heart beat in time with the ticking clock on the wall. At 5 a.m., I quietly woke up the kids. Sarah was still asleep. Her peaceful demeanor was a grotesque contrast to the chaos raging inside me. We left the house and got into the car. The kids were drowsy but didn't ask questions. As we drove away, I took one last look at the house where I had spent the last 15 years. This was goodbye. When Sarah woke up, the sun was already high in the sky. She stretched in bed, content with the calm start to her day off. But a strange feeling made her get up. The house was unusually quiet. She went into the kitchen, expecting to see me or the kids. But it was empty. A piece of paper lay on the table. Her hands trembled as she picked up the note. Just a few words, but they hit her like a ton of bricks. "We're gone. Don't look for us. James." Sarah felt a chill run through her entire body. Her breathing became shallow, and she collapsed onto a chair, trying to process what had just happened. She grabbed her phone, desperately trying to call me, but the call went straight to voicemail. Her fingers quickly typed out a message. "James, what happened? Where are you? Where are the kids?" There was no response. She tried again, but it only deepened her panic. She went into the kids' room, hoping the note was a cruel joke. But the rooms were empty, the beds neatly made. Their closets were missing clothes. She returned to our bedroom and opened the wardrobe. Half of my things were gone. This was no joke or accident. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, covering her face with her hands. Her thoughts circled one question: what went wrong? Meanwhile, we were driving down the highway, further and further away from our city. Amy and Brian sat quietly, occasionally asking how much longer until we arrived. I said little. My mind felt blank, as though all my thoughts had burned up in the house I'd left behind. Finally, Brian dared to ask, "Dad, is Mom coming too?" I pulled the car over to the shoulder and turned to face them. Their eyes were filled with innocence and worry. "Kids?" I began, trying to gather my thoughts. Mom stayed at home. We need to spend some time apart. This is not your fault. I want you to know that I love you more than anything in the world." Amy started crying but said nothing. Brian silently nodded, his hands clenched into fists. I felt my weakness resurfacing. I had no right to take them away from their mother, but it was the only thing I could do to protect us. Sarah sat in silence when her phone suddenly rang. She jumped, thinking it was me, but the screen displayed Jenny's number. "Hi, Sarah. How was lunch yesterday?" her friend asked cheerfully. Sarah froze. "Lunch? Yesterday?" Her heart sank. "Jenny, you didn't tell James that we met, did you?" Sarah's voice trembled. Jenny paused. "We didn't meet, Sarah. Are you okay?" Sarah hung up and began replaying every detail from the past few days in her mind. Her lies no longer seemed like secrets. She couldn't calm her racing thoughts. She spent hours in the empty house, trying to piece everything together. The call from Jenny haunted her. There had been something strange in her voice, a hidden concern that made her words even more unsettling. Sarah tried calling me again, but to no avail. Each failed attempt only heightened her anxiety. The ground beneath her seemed to crumble. Her home, her family, everything that made up her world was falling apart. The years she had believed to be happy now felt meaningless. Every action, every lie, every concealed truth from the past weeks was coming to a head. She went to my study, where I meticulously kept documents in order. Her search for answers to why I had left led to a single question. Why? Why did he leave me? I was the one who always forgave, even when she was entirely in the wrong. Among my papers, she found a note that caught her attention. It was a list of hotels and notes about various locations that didn't match any of our vacations or business trips. The last location on the list was the same hotel I had visited the previous night, a hotel in the city center. The sting of betrayal burned even deeper. She immediately understood that those trips she had considered routine were not coincidences. They were part of a life she had never noticed. Moments later, Sarah picked up the phone and tried calling Jenny again, this time ready for any answers. "Sarah, you need to understand that James truly felt he couldn't live this way anymore," Jenny said when she finally answered. Her voice was calm, but there was a bitterness to it. "You need to ask yourself why he felt the need to act like this, and why you didn't see it coming." Sarah sank into a chair, listening to her friend's words. She knew Jenny was right. She had ignored my doubts, my loneliness. She had lived in her small, insulated world, filled with lies and attempts to hide the truth from herself. Everything became clear now. Years of her betrayals, her lies, her manipulations had culminated in this moment. She felt her inner world slowly, but inevitably, crumbling. Meanwhile, the kids and I were heading into the unknown. The road to wherever we would stay for the next few days seemed endless. I drove, trying to process everything that had happened. But my mind was filled with a single question. Where do we go from here? Amy and Brian sat in the back seat, laughing and playing with their toys. It was carefree on the surface, but I knew it was only a facade for the reality that we had fled from everything. Dad, why are we going to Grandma's instead of back home? Amy asked, throwing me a look full of innocent questions. Because we need to, I replied, gripping the steering wheel tightly. I didn't know if we could ever go back home. I didn't know if I could rebuild what we had lost. But this time I couldn't live with the lies anymore. Sarah stood before the mirror, staring at herself. Her reflection was shattered, her eyes hollow. What now? How could she fix all of this? The broken ideas of herself, her family, and the happiness she once believed in no longer mattered. She had to decide whether to save what remained or let it all fall apart. Her heart had no room for forgiveness, only despair and questions. Despite all the pain, one thought persisted in her mind. What if I've truly lost everything? Sarah left the house, seeking answers. Her fractured mind rejected every attempt at calm. Everything she once believed to be true had turned to ash. How did I miss this? How did he endure it for so long? Her next stop was at friends' houses. She tried to talk, to ask what they thought of her marriage, but their responses were only questions she couldn't answer. Deep down, she no longer believed she had ever been happy. After hours of endless reflection and failed attempts to make sense of it all, Sarah realized she was missing something essential: honesty. From anyone, from James, from herself. That was the final straw. She went to the hotel where she knew I had been but decided she wouldn't ask any questions. Instead, she chose to be alone with what remained. Sarah spent the night at the hotel. Her mind raced, but she eventually managed to sleep. In the morning, she called me, hoping I would answer. James, I don't know what to do, she said when she heard my voicemail for the first time. Maybe this isn't the end? I responded a few minutes later. Sarah, I can't do this anymore. This is it. What we had, it's no longer my reality. That day, she finally understood. The kids and I weren't coming back, and she couldn't trust her ability to make decisions anymore. This chapter marked the end of a significant phase in our lives. Sarah had a long road ahead, one where she needed to find herself. Would she overcome what she had done? Would she find redemption or remain in this emptiness? I woke up in an empty motel room. Amy and Brian slept quietly beside me. I couldn't believe this had happened. It felt like a dream, but the emptiness in my chest reminded me it was real. We had left, we had fled, and now there was no going back. Sarah wasn't with us. She stayed behind, or rather, I left her behind. That was my decision, and now I had to live with the consequences. When the kids woke up, I tried to stay calm and organized. We went to a small cafe, where I ordered coffee while they drank juice. It was a fleeting moment of peace that I couldn't afford to disrupt. The children's innocent, worried glances stung more than words ever could. Dad, are we going to live here? Amy asked, her voice barely concealing her emotions. I couldn't tell her we'd be staying for a long time, that she might not see her mom again, or that everything she knew was a lie. I simply said, don't worry, everything will be fine. We'll find a new place, and it'll be great. But deep down, I knew everything had changed. Forever. Meanwhile, Sarah took the first steps toward regaining her balance. She met with a lawyer. Every step she had taken to this point was deliberate, measured, but her eyes held a grim determination. She was trying to take control of the situation, even if all she could do now was minimize the damage. The lawyer listened attentively, but Sarah felt this was only the beginning. She wasn't sure if it would make things better or worse. I don't know what to do, she admitted at the end of their meeting, fighting back tears. All I have is emptiness. Emptiness is a beginning, Sarah, the lawyer replied. Only from emptiness can you start creating a new reality. I sat on the bed while the kids played in the other room. My thoughts were a chaotic mess. I didn't know if I had made the right decision or if I was still trapped in the shadows of the mistakes that had brought me here. Sarah had stayed behind, and her heart was filled with emptiness too. We all felt betrayed, though each of us carried our own version of the truth. Only time would tell if we could ever reclaim what we had lost, or if we had drifted so far apart that there was no path back. The next day, Sarah set out into the city to find us. Her mind was made up, and though her heart was broken, she couldn't just leave things unresolved. This was her life, her family, and she couldn't simply give up. But what if it was already too late? She was no longer just a wife. She was a woman fighting for her dignity and her children. Her path was uncertain, but she was prepared to move forward, even if it meant enduring more pain. This chapter marked a breaking point between two worlds. Sarah was no longer just a betrayed woman, and I was no longer just a father trying to hold the family together. How could we rebuild that connection? Could we survive what had happened? Sarah found the hotel where I was staying but didn't find us. She wandered around, unsure of what to do. Only now did she fully grasp that she had lost everything. And it wasn't just a physical distance between us. It was an emotional chasm that couldn't be bridged. She tried calling again. I picked up, but there was only silence on the other end. There were no words left between us. I knew we had lost our chance. The kids and I kept moving forward. Yet with each step, I felt like we were walking into the unknown. We were no longer a family, though we remained people who shared stories that were long forgotten. Sarah called me again. "James, this isn't the end. I'm not ready to accept it," she said with determination in her voice. But all I could say was, "No, Sarah, it's over." We were dead to each other, though we continued to exist in the same world. What would we do next? That remained uncertain. I sat behind the wheel, staring at the road stretching into the unknown. The kids were silent. We were all deeply lost in our own thoughts, unable to grasp whether tomorrow would be better or if this would be our forever. Sarah stayed home, trying to face her emptiness alone. She didn't know where we were, and I didn't want to tell her. She had to face this herself. I couldn't do it for her. This was the beginning of something new, yet also the end. We would not return to what once was, and that was now clear. So here's a question for you. Is it truly possible to reclaim what has been lost? Or do we all remain trapped in our mistakes and choices, even when we know there's no way back? What would you do in my place? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd really like to hear how you would handle this situation. And don't forget to subscribe, because this story isn't over yet.